And yeah, that started. Okay, so thanks very much for joining me today. Just for a little bit of context, I'd like to ask you, what is your current role or job title? What's your
Yeah,
connection to education and AI?
yeah. So I work at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo. I'm a professor of practice there. I've been there for like 10 years in this position. And before that, for another 10 years, I was there, but before I finished my PhD, so I wasn't a faculty member. And so my role in terms of education in general is I support the other educators in my institution with their teaching. So I just generally give consultations, I give workshops, I do assessments, and sometimes it's one-on-one with the instructor, sometimes it's institutional work. And I also teach a course to students on digital literacies.
Okay, so there's, I guess, connections to AI from different sorts of perspectives too.
Yeah, and so like my connection with openness, my institution doesn't do a lot of open work, but when there is open work, I'm the one who's leading it. I was the first to get them to work with an Arab MOOC called Idrak. I helped connect them with Pressbooks to do our first open textbook. I try to promote open licenses and things like that, but there isn't like something concrete, big and concrete going on. But I definitely encourage people to go to the Open Education Conference, things like that.
Okay, so that actually kind of leads into one of the questions, which is, what does open education mean to
Mm.
you? And it sounds like, okay, we've got MOOCs, we've got open textbooks, open
Yeah, but
licenses,
it's
open
not what
conference.
openness means to me actually. So this is
Okay.
interesting because
Hmm.
openness means to me openness is open educational practices. And I wrote an article with Suzanne Koscioglu about being the open self. How can we be open? And openness here is not only about sharing things publicly and allowing other people to change them with open licenses, but it's also about openness as an attitude and a worldview of being willing to share incomplete ideas and narrating your practice so that other people can learn from it, and being willing to share incomplete thoughts on open spaces like blogs and social media, and making yourself vulnerable in that way so that others can benefit from your thinking process, not just your finished products. The engagement with other people around the world in an open way, these are to me what openness means, and open pedagogy. And you can have social justice as your goal, but you need to recognize that a lot of open practices, even if they aim to promote social justice, they don't necessarily promote social justice in all of its dimensions. A lot of times people talk about open educational resources and the economic benefit of that, but they miss out on the cultural and political dynamics of like who has funding to create these resources, even if they're going to be free in the end, but whose perspective on the world, which epistemologies are they perpetuating? Um, are the processes hegemonic, or are the processes themselves participatory? Um, and there's a big difference between looking at what educators do with open resources and what learners do with open resources. So there's all of those dimensions of it. But to me, there could be openness that's very, very content focused and not process focused. And I think the process focus is much more important than the outcome. There could be open educational stuff that's teacher focused and student focused, and I think it's good to have both. But if the more we can do it as a student practicing openness versus just the teacher practicing it and imposing it on students, that's important. Also, that students have the right to choose or refuse is
Hmm.
important, because it's not always the level of vulnerability is different for different people. And then whether you're using openness because it's just pedagogically sound, because it's good for learning, versus using it to promote social justice, I think those are two. Sometimes it can be both, but sometimes it's usually one or the other, and you're missing out on one when you only focus on one and not the other.
Okay. All right. So there could be really lots of different perspectives depending on who's talking and what their goals are.
Yeah.
Mhm. And on the other hand, since we're talking about open education and AI, what would you call AI?
What I call AI. So I was a computer scientist before I did my master's and PhD in education. And I know that AI is much broader than machine learning and neural networks. But I didn't take the AI course, I took the neural networks course. And I think when we're talking about AI these days, we're talking about AI, but of course there was a lot of AI beforehand that perpetuated a lot of injustice. For me, it's whenever you ask a machine or create a machine or some digital thing that will do something that usually we used to think only humans could do. Because so to me, as a computer scientist, regular code, you tell it what to do and it does what you tell it to do. But AI, and especially the kind that uses machine learning, you tell it how to learn and you give it data and then you train it to make it more likely to do the right thing, and then you let it go. And the problem here is you don't know how it's reaching its conclusions. Even if it tends to give you the right answer that you're looking for, you have no idea what the process is, versus other kinds of computer programming where you actually know exactly what you taught it to do. And so what I think is people treat it as if it's magical because they don't know how. Even the person who created it doesn't know how it's exactly working, but they do know what kind of data they gave it. They do know what kind of variables they told it to focus on. They know how they trained it, but they still don't know exactly what it's going to do every single time. And I think one of the there's a lot of other AI we've had beforehand that also has that black boxness in it, but it's not as generative AI. So it's making something, but it's not creating something that seems to us like it's creating it from scratch. It's not creating it from scratch, but it looks like that's what it's doing. And so I think it gives a sort of impression as if it's actually really intelligent and really thinking, but we know that it isn't. And so I always I've been teaching students about AI for a long time before ChatGPT was out. And we were talking about facial recognition and the kinds of biases it perpetuates. We were talking about the use of AI in criminal justice and how problematic that is, in recruitment, how problematic that is. But at the same time, it's been used in medicine to diagnose illnesses, and that's been very useful. But also it isn't used to treat patients, it's used to diagnose, but not to treat, because the risks are so different, right? We talked about it during COVID because of algorithmic proctoring, and that used both facial recognition and sort of normalizing what a non-cheating student looks like. And again, that also perpetuated discrimination against people who are just neurodiverse, right? Like neurodivergent. And then we talk about all the other AIs that are part of our lives, like just the YouTube recommendation engine and the Google search and the Turnitin.com for detecting plagiarism. But all of these seem to be like, okay, so the ones that are used in cases like criminal justice, I think they're not allowed to be used anymore. I hope they're not allowed to be used anymore. But things like using it in Google search are so transparent, not transparent, so invisible to us. Like we don't even think about it as AI, but it is, of course. But with the generative AI, I think there's a very, very big problem with accountability that's on my mind a lot right now. Like the lack of transparency, and then who's accountable for what's going on here is always on my mind.
Mm-hmm. It's much like open education. AI is multifaceted all around us, and maybe we don't even see it sometimes.
Yeah.
So, referring back to these definitions, what comes to mind first? How would you define openness in the context of AI in education?
Yeah, I mean, when you asked me to do this interview, I'm I know that David Wiley gave a session about how he thinks open education will now become AI, and I was like, what? I'm going to talk to you. There's a lot of different dimensions to this, but when I talk about openness of process, as that is what I think openness is, and narrating your process, this is the opposite of all the commercial AI tools that we have right now. There are open source, I believe, AI tools that I don't know much about and they haven't experimented with. But even if they're open about their code, if they're open about their data, you still don't know how the AI tool itself is learning the thing to produce the output. But I know there's a lot of people talking about explainability in AI. So if that's the thing that we're going to work on, that's something I want to encourage. I don't know, because I'm a computer scientist, I don't know if your background is scientific or social
I'm
science.
actually a computer science PhD student myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we don't know, right? We know how we've designed the algorithm, but we still don't know exactly what kind of weighting the thing is doing inside itself. Like we don't know why it's making that decision. It can't explain itself, but I know they're working on explainability. So I think if that's something that we can improve, that would be amazing. I don't know. I haven't done any coding in like 20 years. But if that's the thing, then that would be openness. You know, the processes of AI need to become more open. Which data we're using becomes more open. user can tweak the data in the very simple way that we do custom bots. If we can train the entire AI the way we want to, but I know that it requires a huge amount of data to do a large language model. So I don't know how a regular person, how even a person in a emerging economy like me could manage the hardware and the software and the data needed to do something like that. But so to me, it's not open because it's a black box. To me, it's the opposite of openness, because open education includes attribution of your sources, and whatever a generative AI model gives you as an answer, it doesn't tell you how it came up with the answer. You can ask it to give you the source, but it doesn't always give you the actual source that it really used. I've done this with stuff that I'm very deep into, and it will give an answer, but then if you ask it where it got it from, it'll give you a source. Even the ones that give you real sources that aren't made up, they're not necessarily the best source or the original source or the real source of where it got it from. And so I'm quite unhappy with that, because when we think about people saying, oh, we're going to use AI to create more open educational resources and do translation and do all these things, I'm concerned, because you're using the work of someone you don't know and building on it, and you can't verify the quality. Oh, you can verify the quality, but then why are you using AI in the first place? Why don't you just get the things from the original source and work with it? Is what I'm kind of feeling about it. It's not about copyright and paying people. It's about knowing when you're when we build knowledge, we need to actually know who said this in what context and what else did this person say. So like when I'm talking to you now, I do want to know, like, what's your educational background? I didn't ask you where you're from, but in another context, I do want to know where you're from. I wonder why you have sand in your background, for example, rather than trees. Most people put water in trees. But what I'm saying is, a lot of times when we're looking at someone's work, we don't, as humans, as researchers, look at someone's work divorced from their context. And so if I read someone's work, I want to know, oh, is this scholar an African American scholar who's talking about social justice in this way? Is it a woman or is it a man? Where are they based? What else have they written about this, right? And I'm saying this as a researcher, but not everyone's an academic, but any educational material should have that kind of context with it. And AI divorces all of that, just gives us an answer. The ones that I know there are other, like, you can have other tools, but the ones I've seen don't do what I'm looking for in terms of that. So for me, the openness aspect is how we learn about AI together. That's the kind of openness that I want for us to learn with and from each other, so that we can improve our knowledge of it. If openness allows us to improve the way we use AI tools, or to advocate together for better and more responsible use of AI, or to be just more critical, because I'm very frustrated by people talking about how AI is transformative, and I don't think it is there yet. Might be. I don't know that something that's built on so much historically has always been problematic. I'm not really sure why suddenly the new ones are not going to perpetuate racism and sexism. So far, it does. People hardwire it or hard code it to not be explicitly biased, but it's very implicitly biased. So why would I use that? Because we need to be accountable for what we do. And if we're using AI and we don't know how it's giving us the results, and then we're revising it, then we run those risks. Whereas if I'm doing the work myself, I can be accountable for the work I did.
So actually connecting it back to different examples of AI technologies that you mentioned, I think ChatGPT often comes up as the mascot of AI, but like you mentioned, it's not the only thing. Like, for example, Google is also AI, and so is facial recognition.
Yeah.
In these concrete examples, what makes them open or not open?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things, right? First of all, I think people who aren't in the open education field see anything that is free and consider it open. So that's a misnomer, right? Because we know if something is free, we're probably the data and we're paying with our data. So it would be open if, okay, it would be open if it's open source and I can use the API without having to pay for it. It would be open if I could retrain it, which none of them that I know of are, but there are other things that are like that that I haven't used. But also accessibility is not only about cost. Accessibility is also about digital literacy. So one of the things, for example, related to open education more broadly, and about the whole thing of remix and reuse and anyway, all those R's that I don't care about too much, but related to open educational resources, is do most people have the digital literacies and the financial capabilities to retrain something or to redo? Or is it something that only very, very elite people who know programming can do? So for example, Wikipedia editing, Wikipedia as an open resource, right? In the very beginning, it was really difficult to edit it and you had to learn it would take time. And now it's very easy to edit. So that accessibility of being, don't tell me anybody can edit it if it's not actually easy for anyone to edit it. So if it's not easy for anyone to edit, who are the people who are able to edit it and what kind of inequalities does that create? And with Wikipedia, it was this inequality that the majority of people who edited are white males from the West, right? Something like ChatGPT even wasn't even actually available to everybody when it first came out. It was blocked in Egypt and Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia, like quite a few countries. I had to like use VPN and pretend I'm in another country to be able to create an account and use it. So I don't, yeah, I don't, none of those are really open. I guess Google used to be a company that we used to think was good and nobody thinks they're good anymore. I think if I'm able to choose how my data gets used, that would be a useful thing to do for openness. I don't think of any of the AI tools that I have access to as open.
So does openness sort of, in terms of the process that you mentioned about explainability and transparency, so you can make your own judgments about whether, I guess you agree with how that process went, but there's also openness as the lack of barriers to access.
Yeah.
Mhm. And then also, I would be interested to see, what do you see as the potential benefits of using open AI technologies in education and thinking about AI in the broad sense?
Give me an example of what you consider to be an open AI. And
An
explain to
open
me how it
AI.
works, because I clearly don't know them. Because people keep telling me, stop talking about the commercial models, and I keep saying that's the ones all people are using. So it doesn't, what are the ones that are open, that are really open?
Can I come back to you after I've conducted all the interviews?
Do
I
you
believe
know
that
any
will change
though?
my
Do
mind.
you know any yourself? You must know if you're a computer scientist, right? Because
I
I know
have some
people say
ideas, but I think if I start with them now, that's going to kind of
derail the
set
interview. I
our
can't answer this question
conversation.
because I can't
Mhm.
answer this question because like when I answered you, I told you that I don't consider anything to be open. So how can I talk
Mhm.
about the advantages of it if I've never seen it?
Yeah.
I can't talk about it theoretically and give an answer that's meaningful. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like if so, do you want me to sort of speculate on what I would consider an open AI?
Let's try. So if we take all the things that it would take for something to be open, so it's really transparent about how it was written and
Mm,
what data was used to train it and
mm,
how it gets to from inputs to the outputs, the whole process.
mm,
And there's no barriers to access.
mm-hmm.
Now we're in some
And I
utopian
could
thing.
retrain it, and I could retrain it with the data that I want.
Mhm.
I would still honestly, for the most part, I also honestly would question why we want to use AI for certain things in the first place.
Right.
So sometimes this Anne-Marie Scott, who's in Edinburgh, but not right now, employed by the University of Edinburgh, was once saying like, if there's something that we keep saying, oh, it's it's boring work, we'll give it to AI, we should question why we're doing it in the first place. And I think the most important things in education shouldn't be done in this way because we need to think through it and we need to understand why we did it and we need to be able to justify why we did it. So even if the AI was completely transparent about a lot of things, I guess it would be, yeah, I'm not in the kind of mindset I have right now. So I changed my mind a lot about AI in general. That's why I write about it a lot so that that is transparent to other people. But I changed my mind a lot about AI. And right now I'm just pretty frustrated with it. I don't want to, I, I, I keep hearing stories of people trying to, so okay, I'll go back and say, I know there are contexts where the populations are huge and very dispersed, and it's very difficult to give them access to a human educator that is able to respond to them one-on-one on a regular basis in the way that I'm in a privileged situation where, I teach a class of 20 students, but there are people in countries that don't have that opportunity. So I don't feel comfortable with like avatars representing humans in that way. That's very creepy for me. But if there could be a way for me to train the AI, and this is already possible, so you can train an AI like a simple. This is accessible to me. Like I could give an AI a lot of my course material, and then students could ask it questions, and I wouldn't have to answer them myself. I think that could be useful if I always had access to be able to tweak it, and also if learners themselves had a little bit more transparent access to how what it's doing with what they're asking and things like that. But I would still prefer that the students ask other people or ask each other, like even if they don't have access to the expert who's the teacher or whatever. I would want them to be able to speak to another human being. I think the AI that I really, really respect, I still think it's problematic, but I really respect AI for accessibility. So the one that's very clear in my mind is for people who are visually impaired. Obviously, the voice to text and the text to voice already is pretty useful. But also the one where they can like be my AI, which is like takes the picture of something and then explains to them what it is that they're seeing. And I've seen blind people use it, and I've tried it with them before, and it's usually quite accurate. But it's quite accurate within certain cultural contexts because it's not been trained on a broad set of cultural things. So it's not good at reading Arabic. Even OCR, which has existed for a really long time, isn't good at reading Arabic that is not written in a very particular way. So anything that's outside the average of what it's been trained on is problematic. But if we can just train it on whatever we wanted, then that could be a useful thing. So I think AI for accessibility definitely one of the main ones. Um, I think if it was going live rather than you have to take a picture, and I think that's probably within reach, if not possible, but if it was also available to them for free, and they would be able to tweak it to their cultural context, for example, or the things they wanted it to focus on, that would be kind of amazing. I would still be concerned that then other human beings then feel less responsible to support people who have a disability. But at the same time, there's value in a person with a disability becoming independent so that they can manage on their own without seeking help. So this is kind of the area where I'm trying to look at, but this is one of the things that I generally think would be a good direction. It can also help people who are not disabled to help people who are disabled by, for example, and this already exists in Microsoft PowerPoint, for example, that it can generate alternative text. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, VL text for images.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it can generate the alternative text for you so that you don't have to. So if you forget to do it, it'll do it for you. I don't know why it just doesn't do it anyway, but anyway, but you have space to correct it, and then it does save you a little bit of time. So I guess that's useful also to help remind us to do accessibility. It would be nice if it automatically made me check what it wrote and didn't just let me go if I didn't do it. But yeah, so that's a little bit of what I might be okay with.
Yeah, and that I think really speaks to some of the potential opportunities, but also the risks and challenges that need to
Mhm.
be addressed first. All right. Um, as we're coming to the end of a half hour, I don't want you to keep you any longer than we need to. Do you have to go, or do you still have 5 minutes?
I have 5 more minutes.
Okay. I'd like us to revisit the article that you shared at the beginning.
Mhm.
And could you speak a little bit about what in this what is the connection with open AI and education from
Yeah.
your perspective?
Yeah, it has all the keywords. So the article is written with Anna Mills and Lance Eaton, who are in the US. And the article title is How Do We Respond to Generative AI in Education? Open Educational Practices Give Us a Framework for an Ongoing Process. So we're talking about AI as well as COVID as shocks that happen to education. Like nobody really knows what's going on. It's really complex to figure out how to deal with it. And openness in our practices are what helps us deal with it. So open educational practice is a shock absorber, and we talk about people who create like crowdsourced collections of things, people who use social media to ask questions, to share ideas, to share their experiments, to think through things together in community, whether in mailing lists or like public Twitter, people publicly annotating documents together to analyze them. And just the idea of being willing to share rough ideas early on helps everybody know what's happening in different places. And so like one of my other roles that I didn't talk about in the intro is I co-facilitate something called Equity Unbound, which is an open community. And we organize professional development for educators regularly, including a 3-month conference in June, July, August. But when generative AI came about, became a thing that we all needed to focus on in January, Anna Mills and I were talking on Twitter, and we're like, you know what, let's give workshops. People need hands-on workshops to know how to deal with this. And these are things that we were able to do, outside my institution much faster and making it open to everybody to learn. And then I went and did workshops in my institution so I could experiment in an open space before I could do local things. And so this was about us and our willingness to do this while recognizing that, not everybody's willing to do that. There were also a group of people who did, like, they were crowdsourcing 101 creative ideas for using AI in education, for example. It was just Google Slides and then they published it later, but people were just going in and putting things and seeing what other people are doing. And that kind of attitude and that kind of practice, I think, is important. And it's not at all like what AI itself is. And then, of course, there's this possibility of collaborating with students and having students being open. Remember when I said earlier about open educational practices as student-led or teacher-led? When the students themselves are part of co-creating guidelines, for example, on how to use AI. When the students themselves let you know how AI is useful to them and how AI is problematic for them, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, so this really connects open educational practices with the use of AI in education. All right. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. As we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add or discuss about the use or future of open AI technologies that we haven't covered?
There's actually something that you had in your questions, I think, related to AI literacies, but I'm not seeing it necessarily. But anyway, I want you to tell me about the open AIs that I don't know about.
Sure thing. I mean, as we discussed, really, openness can mean many different things. The easy route is, I would say, going down the open source AI path, of which there are many, many examples now of open source models. I guess the most famous ones are the Llama family models that come from Meta. But they're open source because you can download the model, use the weights, and you can also have the training code for it. And if you had like a country's worth of data centers, you could train your own, but
we don't have that.
But it would cost millions. So yeah, their idea is they share their training process, their insights, what they learned from along developing these models. And that's, I guess, their take on open source. To me, that is a big chunk of what open AI would be. But there's also things like, okay, what data was it trained on, and was the data itself open? And then beyond that, if you use the model in an application, which then uses some other data on top besides the model, is the rest of the application open? Yeah. I think that's what open AI really means to me. And in that sense, we don't have anything that's fully open, but we have many parts that could be combined. There are open data sets, and there are open AI models, and there are open applications. I just don't think they've been put together yet.
Okay, that's really interesting. What about the explainability? Like, how close are we to actually having transparency and explainability in the AI models?
Like explainability, like you mentioned, when we use neural networks, it's part of the architecture that they compress and memorize a lot of information.
Mm.
And then we kind of have to undo that to
Mm.
see what information is being used,
Mm.
which is incredibly difficult and time intensive.
Mm.
There's a project called Circuits, where people try to investigate what individual neurons in GPT-2 are responsible for, what triggers
Wow.
them. And it's a
Mm.
massive crowdsourcing task where you have lots of sentences that either very highly or very negatively trigger particular neuron activations. So people
Mm.
try and figure it out, and they have some neurons figured out, but it's a
Mm.
model with millions of parameters.
Exactly. It sounds
So,
crazy. It sounds,
yeah.
you know what it is that my PhD research was about critical thinking.
Hmm.
And so there was one person, there's a lot of different debates about it, but there was one person who was trying to explain critical thinking by explaining the biology and how the brain works. I'm like, this is so low level. It's kind of like trying to explain neural networks with assembly language.
Right.
Right? That's gonna take forever to try to get to something that makes sense, and it's so complex. Like even what you're describing, I know how complex it is. So I'm trying to think, even if you could figure out which neuron, how would you then explain it to another human being? Unless it's like very obvious that, oh, it only actually takes this piece of data. You know, like only that side of the network is lighting up when it's answering that question. But like with something like, I don't know. I don't know where we go from here, but
Yeah, I have
um,
this feeling like full explainability would be too large for humans to be able to process. And so
yeah.
we'll probably eventually have some good enough compromise, very much
Mm,
like we do with people when we
yeah.
explain our thinking process. It doesn't really involve everything that went into it, but just the
Yeah.
key details.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I was just in a bad mood about AI today, really. I'm just really upset with it because I'll explain to you what just happened to me recently very quickly, but this doesn't have to be recorded, but you can record it if you want. But like someone was giving a presentation and they quoted me for saying something that I'd never said
Hmm.
and using a term that I'd never used. And I looked up the term, it doesn't exist online even. The quote actually exists, but someone else said it. And yeah, so I'm like, something went wrong there. Could have been AI, could have been a person who made the mistake, but it's a very weird mistake.
Yeah, strange.
And the fact that so many people are doing that now is just annoying me. So,
I saw Laura Chernyavich also
yes,
shared a post
oh,
that
it's
she was
awful.
hallucinated, right?
Yeah, it's awful. Like, and the journal can't be, I guess, accountable for that because they can't check every single reference that the authors. I mean, I guess we could develop a tool that would check all the references. But the authors that they would do that, like add the reference and add a paragraph about, oh my God, it's just. And the thing is, somebody will read those other people's article and use, Chernovich as cited by without reading the original article, right? And that'll just keep going the more we do that. So
Well, we're going to enter a strange future.
yeah,
All
but
right.
it
So I
was really
really
nice to
appreciate your
talk
time. It
to
was
you.
brilliant meeting you. Thank you very
So how do I
much.
say your name? Vidminas, Vidminas?
You
How do you
got
say
it. Vidmanas is
it?
original, although I
Okay.
usually go by Vid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All
All
right.
right. So
Thank you
nice
so
to
much.
meet you, and I will come back to you once I have worked through our interview and have like a clipped down version to check if that's
Okay.
okay with you.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.
All right. All
All
the
right.
best and have a great day.
You too.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.
Bye.